My name is Nicki Ruiz de Luzuriaga. I'm the Vice President of Institutional Advancement at EMPath, and it's my great honor today to be moderating this really exciting session, Ideas with Impact. This is sort of an experiment for us. We've never done this before. It is a very unique kind of a session that we're going to be doing. We've invited a bunch of people, 5 people, who we think are really smart, and we've invited them to come and tell us about an idea that they're excited about. And so we're going to give them each a little bit, just a very short amount of time to talk about one idea that they're really excited about. And they're going to have just that short amount of time to present, and then we'll all come together on the stage to do a little chit-chat and to answer questions from the audience. So if you could please hold your questions until the end. We will get to them, but just at the end. And throughout, we're going to be live streaming this. And so, like I mentioned, if you want to tell your friends back home to watch the live stream, they can put their questions on Twitter and we will read them. And if you're a person who's a little shy and you don't want to ask a question in this big room of people, you can also put your question on Twitter and we'll read it out as well. Okay, so without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is David Ellwood. David is the Isabel and Scott Black Professor of Political Economy and director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Go HKS. He also served as the chair of the U.S. Partnership on Mobility from Poverty, a group of 24 leaders from across disciplines whose mission was to consider what it would take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty. David has previously served as Assistant Secretary for Planning and Evaluation in the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, where he was co-chair of President Clinton's initial efforts on welfare reform. Recognized as one of the nation's leading scholars on poverty and welfare, Elwood's work has been credited with significantly influencing public policy in the U.S. and beyond. Please join me in welcoming David Ellwood, whose talk is titled, Thinking Deep and Thinking Big.
Hello, everyone. That's very good. So I thought about bringing a picture of me as a young assistant professor, when they had corded telephones and stuff like that. But I was sitting in my office, new assistant professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and the academic dean came into my office. And his opening line was, "I'm a success and you're a failure." And, your life passes before your eyes. This is your whole future. He says, no, it's true. He said, I'm all about preventing nuclear war. And every morning when I wake up, I've had a good day. He said, I get in the car and I drive into school and I see a homeless person and I know you've failed another day. So, I mumbled something about being in a growth industry or something, but still, it's a very memorable moment in my life, still, nonetheless. And I've always been what I would call a radical incrementalist. I used to say, look, I don't know how to get to the top of the mountain, but I know which way's uphill. And if you go uphill long enough, you're making progress. But 35 years later, it's kind of frustrating. That hill seems like it's taller, not shorter. And I think we're all kind of think we're working as hard as we could possibly work, and yet, we're not failures. It probably would be worse without us, but yet, what? And so I was actually really primed when the Gates Foundation and the Urban Institute came to me and sort of said, we want you to lead a group, and it's not a commission, it's going to be an idea factory, and the question you guys are supposed to answer is, what would it take to dramatically increase mobility from poverty? You don't have to agree on anything, you just got to come up with ideas. Oh, okay. So we did have 24 folks. You've heard some about this before, maybe from Nisha or whatever. Half scholars, half practitioners, including our most prominent and terrific member, Beth Babcock here. Nisha Patel was the one that was the executive director and did all of the work. But the interesting feature, this was extraordinary people, you'd recognize many of them, and it was diverse in every way. It ranged, Republicans and Democrats and scholars and so forth. And but it was a really, and what we did is we went all across the country. We saw people all across the country in various settings and so forth. Everything from Bed-Stuy to Silicon Valley to the Mississippi Delta to Lummi Nation in Washington State to Houston to Texas to Atlanta to Maine. And then we found we agreed on a whole lot more than we expected. And the first thing we actually agreed on is what we meant by mobility. And what we meant by mobility turned out to be, well, yes, we want everybody to have a reasonable standard of living, but we also felt very strongly that it was all about the dignity that comes from having genuine control over your life and being part of and valued in a community. And the truth is, I can speak for myself, I've always said those words, but I really just meant I'm going to focus on income. And if the cost of keeping the food stamps program is maybe you're going to have a work requirement, maybe it's worth it. But those are bringing really important things into conflict. And so, number one, thinking carefully about how you do all of that as mobility is critical. But then the second point was, when you go to all these different places, you discover there are different stories in different places, but we ended up thinking there are five things, every one of which you have to do, and no one can do all five. No institution, no government, no person can do all five. And so what are those five? And again, many of you have seen this. One is you have to change the narrative. The second, you have to make sure everyone has access to good jobs. Third, you've got to be sure zip code is not destiny. And finally, fourth, you have to, when you do help people, individuals and families, they have to be done in a way that empowers folks, certainly a big theme of this conference. And finally, data is an essential feature of the solution because it both is a way to provide the best possible services and support for people as well as communities and to hold ourselves accountable. So it's narrative, it's good jobs, it's neighborhoods, it's service that empowers, and it's data. And here's the fundamental problem. Each one of those is a killer. And if you're good at one, you're not likely to be good at another, or at least not most of them. And yet, if you say it's very obvious, though, why you can have the best services in the world if there's no jobs. Maybe you get your person into the job, but that's somebody else that doesn't get that job. And you can have all the jobs in the world, but when we go to Silicon Valley, jobs aren't the issue, but living there is. And you go to the Mississippi Delta and you say, holy mackerel, they got no jobs and but they got community. So all of those are things that somehow you have to do. And so the question is, obviously, to do any one of those things, you have to think deep. And the more you work on it, the deeper you want to think, because it's harder than you think, even to do any one of those. So how do you solve the problem that all five are necessary? So I don't know. So I'm done. That's your job. It is your job. But I think I have a few starting points, at least to begin the discussion. And the first is to recognize, number one, I think narrative is everyone's job. Now, when an economist tells you that narrative is important to do, you better be worried. But nonetheless, narrative defines everything. And we basically said, anytime you're in a situation where the narrative is either what's wrong with those people or those people are all victims, you're in deep trouble. Narrative is important not only because it sets the agenda and makes it possible to do everything, it also helps determine how people feel about themselves when they're struggling to get ahead. And our group, and different folks have different views, but our group ultimately concluded the biggest problem with all of our narratives is the othering that's contained in them. We talk about the poor, okay? If we talked about the blacks or the women or the white guys, that's not we, it's them. And yet we do it all the time. I have done that all the time. We don't talk about struggling families, we talk about the poor. And over and over in so many different ways, we use narratives that make it us versus them, 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 when we got to be talking about our struggling families. And so the antidote to this is belonging, not one, it's not that everybody's the same, but everyone belongs. And so that has to be a part of every day, changing the narrative for in your own world, and frankly, across the world. And how we do that, I don't know, but it's all of our jobs every day. It is not a second thought. It is not something economists can say, oh, I'm just an economist. Not that economists are that helpful anyway. Second, thinking deep is absolutely vital. I couldn't believe it more. But you also have to simultaneously build up. That's what I love about the EMPath program. It's what I love about this conference. It's about a collaboration among people within a particular stove, a particular range of things. And you say, we're going to learn the best. We're not going to try and take over the world individually, but collectively, we're going to learn and grow and change and adapt and do really well on our piece of the 5. But I still haven't solved the other 4 or the other pieces. So how do we do that? Some people say, well, we just need a really dynamic leader with a perfect plan. Well, I'm for that. Good luck with it, but I'm for it. Other people say we just got to all get together and work collectively. Kumbaya. I'm for that too, but the institutions I've run, that doesn't work very well. So instead, what I would argue is what we've got to think about is becoming a web, knitting together an opportunity web, so that your job, wherever you are, is, yes, thinking deep, but it's also to making connections and looking for, do we have someone working on jobs, even if it's not my primary job? If not, we got to build something together. And if there is, then we got to work together. I've got to have some of my people, maybe being interns over there, members of my board, thinking together. I've got to encourage maybe myself, but maybe it's the mayor, maybe it's foundations, maybe it's universities to convene us and talk to each other, not because we're all going to go on the same page, but we're going to figure out how, if I work with you and you work with me, we will both be much more effective in what we do. If instead we're competing for the same dollars and putting each other down, that's the last thing you want to know. You can see all you're doing is digging the hole deeper rather than making progress. A web of opportunity. How you build that's going to vary, but it's absolutely essential, an opportunity web. The last point I will make is just this. Data. Data is just so unbelievably powerful. You know that by looking at, say, Raj Chetty's data in the operating institutions. You think about those neighborhood data. That's just unbelievable, and that's just scratching the surface. There is no business on the planet that's really growing that doesn't think data is the most important thing in their world. Facebook and Google and so forth will give you their services for absolutely free because they get your data. And you give it to them because you like hearing about the products they come up with sometimes and so on. And yet, the data that we have individually and through our various institutions about struggling families is unbelievable. And yet, one of the first visits I did was to Baltimore, and the Commissioner of Public Health there said the following to me. Said, as part of being the Commissioner of Public Health, I sit in periodically in these meetings, ad hoc meetings, where we go with the other commissioners, go over every childhood death in Baltimore since our last meeting. And you know what? Each of us has a stack of material in that family or that kid, virtually always that high. And the first time we compare notes is after the kid is dead. Now that's a crime. And we are understandably fearful about sharing our data. We're understandably fearful about what data can be misused. But our job isn't to try and stop it. Our job is to make it work because that's where the lessons are. That's how we learn what works. That's how we admit that ours didn't work. That's how we begin to knit together these 5 different elements. So that's my list. That's not one idea. It's a billion ideas. But ultimately, my comment is just this. Thank you for what you do. It is unbelievably important. My academic dean is wrong, and frankly, Korea is scaring me a lot anyway. But you have to work not only thinking deep, you also have to think big. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Michelle Derr, a senior researcher at Mathematica Policy Research. She specializes in evaluating employment and training initiatives targeted to public assistant clients, ex-offenders, individuals with disabilities, and other populations, visiting more than 130 localities in 35 states and territories as part of this work. She's currently serving as a principal investigator for an evaluation of coaching interventions for TANF recipients and other hard-to-employ populations, and a study of goal achievement strategies for low-income populations. Putting her knowledge into practice, she leads an effort across the country to improve the quality of technical assistance and create stronger linkages between program technical assistance and evaluation. She has been involved with developing and delivering evidence-based TA using a process called Learn, Innovate, Improve, an evidence-informed, systematic process for working with stakeholders to improve quality and achieve target outcomes, often with no funding or policy change, which is very exciting. Please join me now as we welcome Dr. Michelle Derr, who will speak on rapid cycle redesign.
Is it on? There it is. There we go. Thank you for allowing me to be here. I think that was the hardest part of this whole presentation, is listening through all of that. I describe myself as a researcher gone rogue. I've studied employment and training programs for the last 20 years. Many of your neighborhoods I've visited. And it came to a point in my career about 4 years ago, and I stopped and I said, as a researcher, let me see what's really going on. I mean, I continued to do that, but really started to focus in on, let me see how I advance these slides. Sorry about that. There we are. Okay, there we go. There's David Ellwood. Okay, there's me. Okay, that's, okay. So what I saw in going out and studying programs were three things. First of all, I saw transactional relationships. That programs really became about processing people and checking boxes, and not about having meaningful exchanges. What we also saw is that programs often didn't meet the needs of customers. One of my pet peeves is having these lengthy assessments and then referring clients to the same 6 weeks of independent job search. You know that's true. We also saw really limited impacts. People could get jobs, but they didn't keep them, and they really didn't get out of poverty. So we said, how do we do this differently? And that led us down a path to say, how do we work with programs differently to really draw upon research evidence and start to build evidence in a different way? And how do we design and test new and promising interventions? So that led us to the development of this process called Learn, Innovate, Improve. Even though it sounds simple, the development of it took about 1.5 years to 2 years. We brought together the research community. We brought together people who did change management strategies, Plan, Do, Study, Act, human-centered design, and other strategies that were used in other disciplines. And we brought them together, and we tried out these methods with practitioners to get the wording right. So instead of logic model or theory of change, we came up with roadmap for change. Because when we said logic model, people zoned out. But when we said roadmap for change, they listened. So we vetted this process and co-created it with practitioners. Now, Learn, Innovate, Improve is a whole host of rapid-fire methods that really can help a program better understand in the learn phase, what problem are you trying to solve? And what is it about your program environment that can help or hinder that change process? In the Innovate stage, we bring in research, known science, and practice wisdom. Sometimes that's all you have is practice wisdom, to help co-create and redesign strategies that practitioners are invested in, that programs are invested in, and getting a really strong linkage between what is the strategy that you're using and what would you expect to see in the outcome, and getting that narrative alignment and having discipline in the change process. And then that leads to the third stage, improve. trying out and testing new and innovative solutions to figure out what works and for whom. And it can be as small as what we'll call road testing or trying things out, and that puts you on an on-ramp for more rigorous methods, finally to more rigorous methods like randomized controlled trial evaluations. This process has several hallmarks to it. One, it's a co-creative process where researchers and practitioners are working together or practitioners working alone trying to figure out what is it that they can do differently. The second part is using analytic methods to do that. The third hallmark of this is really drawing upon the research evidence and really helping that to inform the process. And then finally, it's focused on evidence building. And I say evidence building, small e for practitioners to make everyday decisions, and big E to help shape and change the field. So, how did we use it? And I'll give you some concrete examples. So, Philadelphia, we're working in Philadelphia. And what we found in doing a start of a program redesign was in the environment itself, during that learn stage, we found that in that first exchange with customers were filling out between 50 and 80 pieces of paper before they even see a case manager, right? So using the learn, innovate, improve process, we got that down to 5 pages of information. We did a whole host of other, and still are continuing to do a whole host of other changes. That's just one example. Another great example is from my friends in rural community in La Plata County, Colorado. In Colorado, we took the LI² process and did a statewide innovation initiative. For 9 months, we brought them to the table and we said, we co-created with them. And we helped inspire their thinking around how do you get clients to show up? How do you increase engagement in program activities? And each of the 16 counties that came to the table had different ideas and approaches to do that, all using this LI² process. One of the innovative solutions that came out of that process was La Plata's. So you'll see up in the right-hand corner, we did a network analysis. What happened in that community is there's very little public transportation, and families had difficulty getting access to services. So what we did with them is mapped out in a network analysis. What are all the services in the community, and what are the ways to get there? And then they co-created and came up with this idea themselves to do, instead of their appointments, their coaching appointments in the office, they said, let's pick them up and do those coaching appointments in the car while we drive them to get access to WIC, to get signed up for a GED class, right? To start at the community college. And what that did was it gave them an entryway into these services, and while the worker was there, if there was a fee that needed to be paid or some obstacle that would have prevented the client from really being able to get enrolled, they were able to take care of that right on the spot. Another example is start to finish, the goal for it process. I started out again 4 years ago. That researcher gone rogue and said we have to use science and research to help inform practice in a new and different way. Beth and her team was really leading the field in terms of bringing in executive function and self-regulation into the field of serving families who are living in poverty. And really what happened was we co-created with practitioners this process and with the science community and iteratively tested. And 4 years later, we have a process called Goal for It that's being tried out and tested. And what we learned was targeting clients, that client-worker interaction wasn't enough. So now we've developed co-creatively a process for goal setting between supervisors and staff that mirrors the same process that staff are using with clients. And now we've realized it's not enough. We have to go to goalforit.org and figure out the narrative alignment and the change process for program structure, culture, and leadership that will help support that kind of embracing of the science and the application of really using these kind of self-regulatory techniques. And fundamentally shifting agencies from these transactional relationships to programs that focuses on helping people, activating a client's motivation and commitment to change. This is now being rigorously tested in a federal evaluation And our project officer is actually here in the room. Give a shout out to Gabrielle, one of the project officers. So I just want to get, again, those are the kinds of things that you can change in using this process. I just want to share with you one very familiar technique that's part of the LI squared process. It's not the only technique, but it's a common one. And that's called road testing. Some people have called it piloting. We call it an enhanced analytic pilot in some ways. But again, the language, road testing. It's trying something out, a new innovation that you've developed in the innovate stage, and trying it out with a small number of staff, with a small number of clients, and tweaking it and testing it to figure out how do you refine it. This has a powerful effect in a variety of ways. It reduces change fatigue on staff, and it also gets their buy-in to the process. This doesn't require a researcher to do this. We have programs that have no research shop that are doing this, and staff ask for this process because it's a more manageable way of change. This is an actual road test process of going through, trying something out, gathering iterative data, bringing that research back to the program, testing it out again. They make suggestions for how to change it, testing it out again, so you see multiple learning cycles in that process. So in some, I just wanted to kind of point out to you, if you would have told me as a researcher that practitioners would take analytic research techniques and far surpass what the research community ever had envisioned, I would have thought you were crazy. But you have, and you do, and you continue to come to the table to co-create with us to make promising interventions that can really build evidence for the field. And again, I think the process has also taught us that we can solve everyday solutions with these kind of analytic techniques and drawing upon the research evidence. And then finally, my motto is always fail fast and learn fast, and then apply that learning to really improve outcomes for children and families. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Michelle. That was a lot to think about. Very exciting. So our next speaker is Luke Tate. Luke serves as Assistant Vice President and Executive Director of Opportunity Initiatives at Arizona State University, leveraging scientific and technological innovations to expand opportunity for all Americans. In this capacity, he oversees initiatives related to artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, and the future of work in higher education. He is also a professor of practice at ASU's School for the Future of Innovation in Society, a senior sustainability scholar at ASU's Julianne Wrigley Global Institute of Sustainability, a fellow at the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, and a non-resident fellow at Urban Institute. I don't know, do you sleep or? Luke most recently served as Special Assistant to President Obama for Economic Mobility on the White House Domestic Policy Council, where he ran a team working on economic mobility. He previously served at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development as a senior advisor for urban policy and as a special assistant to the U.S. Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Please join me in welcoming Luke Tate, who will speak on using new technologies to disrupt poverty.
I'm so excited to be here with you. Thank you for the mission that you've chosen in your life and in your work. I couldn't be more grateful to be here with you. I'm here today to talk to you about expanding our thinking around the tools that we use to fight poverty, beyond policy, beyond some of the tools that we're used to. But to give you a little context, I'll tell you a little bit about me. I grew up in Central Phoenix. I grew up in a community where most of the kids I was growing up with didn't have a very good default trajectory in life. Our community was a violent community. A lot of kids got caught up in gangs stuff. They started families before they were ready. Very few of them went on to four-year colleges. And I was largely sheltered from all of that. I mean, I had every advantage you could possibly want. I was a straight white guy growing up in Phoenix in the 80s and the 90s. My parents were both educators, right? But I could see that the factors that were limiting so many of my classmates from fulfilling their potential in my mind at the time, I thought, policy is the way that we're going to change these injustices. We're going to right these injustices. And so I went into policy. As you heard, I spent the last many years running the economic mobility team at the White House for President Obama. And, to be perfectly honest, a lot of what we tried to do there, we didn't find fantastic partners on the Hill to work with in those endeavors. When Charlie and Nisha and I and many others put together what would have been the strongest boost to TANF since 1996 restructuring from AFTC, we knew that was dead on arrival at the Hill. When we put together a plan that would have ended homelessness for families with kids nationwide, would have ended it at only $11 billion over 10 years. Sounds like a big number, 11 over 10. 11 billion over 10. We spend more than $100 billion every single year subsidizing homeownership, right? We could have ended homelessness for families with kids for pennies on the dollar, dead on arrival on the Hill. This doesn't mean we gave up, right? We still managed to reduce veteran homelessness by 50%, reduce family and chronic homelessness by 20%. We saw the largest drop in child poverty since the 1960s. We didn't give up. But it did mean we had to find other tools. And so for the last many years at the White House, that's what I got in the habit of doing. Looking not just to policy for answers, but to outside tools, outside partners. And that led me more and more to look for emerging technologies and emerging businesses where those technologies and tools are in the first instance generally put toward profit maximizing ends, but they can be redirected for social goals. I'll give you one rather idiosyncratic example. When you run the poverty desk at the White House, lots of sad things come across your desk. And one day it came across my desk, some work from Megan Smith, that diapers, that low-income families were spending $936 a year on average on diapers. And I thought to myself, my daughter was about 18 months old at that time. This was before our twin boys were born. That's when you really learn how expensive kids are. But my daughter was about 18 months, and I thought, I'm spending half that, $936 a year. I'm spending half that because I've got Amazon Subscribe and Save, right? Direct to my door every month, purchased in bulk. Whereas families who are walking down to the 7-Eleven, walking down to the CVS, they're paying 50 cents a diaper. Nationally, on average, folks are paying 31 cents a diaper. I was paying 14, 15. And so I wanted to know what are the consequences of this one rather idiosyncratic example of how expensive it is to be poor in America. And we learned that for families in the bottom quintile of income, with infants and toddlers, nationwide, families in the bottom quintile, they are spending 14% of their after-tax income on diapers alone. 14% before you get to rent, before you get to food, before you get to heat, right? Well, what happens? What does that financial crisis cause? It causes a public health crisis. When you have a necessary good, you're trying to make it last. Families leave kids in diapers maybe longer than they ought to. They're dirty. You see a rise in skin conditions. You see a rise in kidney trouble, UTIs. I see a rise in child abuse because when kids are left in diapers, they're dirty, longer than they ought to be, they cry, and they get hit. So I said, all right, well, we can't, you can't use, WIC doesn't supply diapers. That's not going to be the solution. We can't get Medicaid to cover diapers. We're not going to get legislation for that, right? We don't want food stamps to be able to cover diapers because then families are trading out food for diapers. Some people said, well, why don't you just tell those poor people to use cloth diapers? Another example of the othering. Okay, well, that may work for you with your cloth diaper system where they come to your door and they pick them up and they take them away, or you have your own laundry in your house. You can't take those down to the laundromat. Meanwhile, we're telling families we want them to work. You can't drop your kid off at daycare in a cloth diaper. So what's the solution? Well, it wasn't going to be policy. So we went out and we said, how do we get the advantage that I was getting, right? How do we get that advantage to more families who need it? And so we went out to the largest e-commerce shops in the country. We said, how can we solve this problem together? Jet raised their hand and said, we'll work with you. Now, what are the barriers to low-income families achieving the same economies of scale that I was? Well, you have to have access to credit to make that purchase. You have to have access to capital, right? You have to have the ability to receive packages at your door, which many families don't have, right? Now, largely, Android phones have solved the access to broadband part of that problem. Now, you have to solve all of those problems if we want to solve the bigger problem of how expensive it is to be poor in the United States. But we weren't going to wait to solve all those problems. We said, all right, what can we do first to drive down the cost? So we worked with Jet, found their highest quality, lowest cost supplier. We said, how can we reduce the cost without harming the quality at all? Well, first we took off all the colors on the packaging. We took off all the designs. We packed more into every box. And we got the cost down to 13.5 cents a diaper, right? 13.5 cents. Now we said to Jet, can you sell these at cost to these families? We don't want you to take a loss, but sell them at cost, and you'll realize the benefit of having a larger overall supply chain, better economies of scale for you. They said, okay, we can do that. So we said, how do we get these diapers into the hands of families? Well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to make this deal available to any nonprofit in the country. Any nonprofit anywhere in the United States of America who touches these families, every week, if not every day. Every single one of you in this room who is on the board of a nonprofit or who works at a nonprofit, you can access this right now. It is still available. We said we're going to make that available for every nonprofit in the country. We rolled this out in March or April 2016. By the end of the year, they had shipped 15 million. 15 million diapers into the hands of families at the lowest cost that anyone in the country is paying. Now, that's one example of how And when you think of the mothers and the fathers who were pained by their inability to care for their kid, right? This was unlocking, taking away just one of those barriers, one of those hurdles. Now, this is possible in many other realms. We did a similar thing with big data. Aiden Van Noppen and I worked on that. I should say Josh Miller was my partner on this diaper project, who had sold his company to Facebook, wanted to do something more fun. So these were tools that we employed at the White House, but we're working on employing them now at scale at Arizona State University. Just to give you a sense of the mission of ASU, I'll be very quick with this, but over the past 15 years, ASU's been on a journey. Michael Crow moved over from Columbia. He's now the president over there. A journey from a party school to one of the elite schools in America. Now, most schools, as they become elite, become elitist, right? We have more national merit scholars than Stanford. We are now 9th in the nation for research for universities without a medical school. That's ahead of Princeton, that's ahead of Caltech. Most universities on that trajectory, they become elitist, not just elite, not us. We said we will grow to accommodate whatever student wants to be a part of ASU, right? That's our mission. And so that's what we've done. We have grown because in our charter, we define our success by who we include, not who we exclude. And we take fundamental responsibility for the community of which we're a part. That is in our charter. It's literally carved in stone. Come visit me. It's carved in stone at the entrance to our university. So now what that means is that we've gone from having 97% of our incoming freshman class above median income to this year's Arizona freshman class incoming half of our freshman class was below median income. 20% of our freshman class was below the poverty line. And what we do to facilitate their success is that we put these same types of technologies in service of our students. I'm using AI right now to optimize our student success coaching function to help students overcome the non-academic barriers to learning. Their executive function, time management, familial and other stressors. We can study every single input they give us to predict if a student's going to fail a course, if they're going to fail an exam. We can get to them first with the most effective possible response. We're using big data and complex systems analytics to model the entirety of Arizona's educational system. Every single educational outcome, every input that has a causal tie to those outcomes. Educational inputs and extra educational inputs, like those we studied in the Opportunity Project. Right? So we can find every school in Arizona, who are the positive outliers, who are the negative outliers, what can we do to lift them up? We're studying with respect to autonomous vehicles, not just how can they be beneficial to you and me, how can they reduce the highest two fixed costs for working families? Their housing costs, by unlocking lower cost land while retaining mobility, and their transportation costs. Not every family needs a second car. So every single tool that you're seeing out there on the front page of the New York Times, or Wired, or whatever, let's think about how we can put those tools in service of the families that you and I have dedicated our lives and our careers to serving, okay? I'm so grateful to be with you here today.
Thanks so much, Luke. That was great. Our next speaker is Nathalie Laidler-Kylander. Nathalie is a managing director at DRK Foundation, where she's responsible for identifying and supporting DRK entrepreneurs. She currently serves on the boards of 9 DRK portfolio organizations. Nathalie is one of the world's leading experts on nonprofit brand management. She's been a practitioner as well as an academic over the course of her career. Her courses and multiple publications have targeted nonprofit leaders with the goal of building marketing and branding capacity in the sector. Nathalie has supported many of her students as they created and launched social enterprises, both at Tufts University, where she taught entrepreneurial marketing, and at Harvard, where she taught strategic management for nonprofits. Today, she is here to speak about catalytic collaboration, a topic she published an article about in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. Welcome, Nathalie.
No? Good afternoon. So it's a pleasure to be here. I have to tell you a funny story first. It's wonderful to share this stage with David Ellwood, who was my boss for 5 years. And when I first met David, it was at a reception for new faculty, and I found myself standing next to him, and I turned to him and I said, "Oh, and how are you affiliated with the school?" He was the dean at the time, so that doesn't say a lot for my political savviness. But what I'd like to talk to you about today is catalytic collaboration. Let's see if we can pull up the slides. Okay, great. So the issue area that you're dealing with, but a lot of other problems that we face, including environmental degradation, look a bit like this blackboard. Incredibly complex, multifaceted, intractable or seemingly intractable problems. And as been mentioned several times today, these are problems that we can't fix alone. We need to be together in multiple ways to be able to address those problems. But a big question is how to work collaboratively. It's not easy, and David mentioned that. It's great to work together, but working in collaborations is really hard. And so we were interested in trying to understand how we as organizations can work better and also better together. So we devised a strategy, myself and some co-researchers, to try to identify were there some organizations across a number of different sectors that were doing things a little bit differently, that were collaborating in a way that was somewhat unusual. So in the spirit of collaboration, 10 of us worked together, and we did about 30 interviews. And these were not randomized. They were just sort of organizations that people told us were doing something interesting in the space of collaboration. And we interviewed those organizations. And what I'd like to share with you is certainly not good research, but it's sort of emerging thoughts about how some organizations are working in slightly different ways to push or to address this question of how do we work more collaboratively, more effectively together. And so there are 4 real main themes that emerged. The first was this idea of prioritizing learning, and I think we've heard that a couple of times today. And prioritizing learning not just for your own organization, but for the sector and the field that you're working in. The second area or theme that emerged was this idea of systems thinking, but also systems acting. And what I mean by that, I'll share an example, but is to really try to map out with others what a particular problem looks like and where the levers for change might be, as well as understanding where you fit within that system. The third theme we came across was this idea of democratizing access to assets. And I'll share what that looks like. But I think we're emerging into a world where ownership of assets is much less important than the access and ability to use those assets. And then fourth, we noticed that some of these organizations were really trying to build long-term relationships. So somebody mentioned today the idea of these transactional relationships, but what we saw is that people were moving away from more transactional relationships between organizations to this idea of building long-term transformational relationships. Those were the 4 themes, and I'm going to give you an example of each of one of these, even though some of these organizations were actually showing a number of these traits. This is probably why I got invited to the conference. So EMPath was one of our organizations, and I think what's happening today is sort of a manifestation of this idea of prioritizing and sharing learning. So the concept is really about creating knowledge not just for the sake of your own organization's impact and success, but really to be focused on the broader mission of increasing or addressing a problem, and understanding that co-creating or collaborating to learn is as important to moving the sector forwards. And so that's something that we saw EMPath doing pretty wonderfully. And there's this idea of this co-creation that was just mentioned as being the basis really for innovation as well. The second theme was around systems thinking, and I worked with the Breast Cancer Fund that's now called Cancer Prevention Partners. But what they did is they spent a lot of time inviting a number of people to sit with them and map out what does the breast cancer system look like. So 80% of breast cancer is actually caused by exposure to toxins in our environment, both in our food, but also the products that we put on our skin. And what they did is they sat down with a large number of people, tried to map out how these toxins come into our food and products, and understand what were the levers that could be addressed to try to prevent breast cancer by addressing the use of these toxins. And so I think it's really important to think about systems dynamics because of the circularity of the problems that we're addressing and the feedback loops that we encounter and the unintended consequences of some of the work that we do. So if you can work with others to map out this broader system, understand where you fit in that system and stick to that, do that well, but really try to understand and identify partners that have the ability to address other points in the system. And so Jeannie spent a lot of time mapping this out and then coming up with strategies with other partners to address the key levers. And then finally, actually two more things, democratizing access to assets. So the New Play Network really helps budding new playwrights to develop some plays and get those plays performed. And so if you think about it, there are dozens and hundreds of small local theaters, but they don't have the resources necessarily to find and screen and kind of get new plays. So what they did is they shared this database, and they asked people to review those plays and to share their information so that it reduces the cost for every one of those smaller theaters to be able to access good material and put on those plays. And so that was this idea of getting access to assets. I'm running out of time. Okay, and then the last one was this idea of building relationships, long-term relationships with unusual players and unusual actors. And we had a great example, I think, here of really going to a diaper manufacturer to understand whether they could play a role in reducing the cost of access. And so that's, I think, another example is the Gettysburg Project, where all these players came together because of a failure and tried to understand what they could do differently, how they might work to build a longer-term relationship to increase civic engagement and the success of civic actors. So this little diagram, what it says underneath is, what if we, this idea that hope isn't a strategy, what if we don't change anything? We do need to change the way we work. We need to change the way we work together and the way we work internally and across organizational boundaries. And I know that change is hard, and particularly when you're trying to invest time and energy and resources outside of your own organization. Elizabeth and I were talking about that because you have to argue to your board that it's okay to spend time, money, and resources building building change outside of your organization, that's sometimes a hard pill to swallow, but we really believe that it's important to do. So I'd leave you with 3 things. 1, focus on the learning and lead with learning, not just for your organization, but the sector as a whole, because this idea of lifting all boats, a tide that rises. The second thing is, really try to explore enlightened self-interest. And what I mean by that is not just how this relates to your organization and your organization's impact immediately now, but how can sort of being giving of data and exchanging information and access to assets, how does that create an environment where your organization will be successful along other organizations? And then finally, this idea of technology, which is critical, but I would say technology not as an end, but as a means to an end. And so we really saw a number of players that were using technology as an effective way to increase collaboration. I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Nathalie. That was great. Our final presenter in this session is Paul Franciso. He comes from another world. Paul is the Chief Diversity Officer and Head of Workforce Development Programs at State Street Corporation. He leads the implementation of State Street's global diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. Prior to joining State Street, Paul was a managing director and co-founder of Foster and Francisco, LLC, an executive search and diversity consulting firm. He has also held recruitment and relationship management positions at Bank of America and Fidelity Investments. Paul is an active member of the community and is involved with a number of professional organizations. Most recently, Paul was appointed by Massachusetts Governor Charlie Baker to serve on the Black Advisory Board Commission. He has received many awards and recognitions throughout his career, including a Certificate of Achievement from Governor Deval Patrick for his work with the Hispanic community, and he was named in Boston Business Journal's 40 Under 40 and El Planeta newspapers' 100 Most Influential Latinos in Massachusetts. Today, Paul is here to speak with us about the for-profit world's role in disrupting poverty. Welcome, Paul Franciso.
Hello. Excellent, excellent. Hello, the world. How are y'all doing? Thank you for the introduction. I am here actually to talk about another example of a catalytic collaboration. And, as one of the largest financial services companies in the world, when you consider that State Street Corporation is the #1 custodial bank in the world. So we custody assets under custody of $29 trillion. And when we are second largest asset manager in the world with assets under management of close to $3 trillion, then the question we need to ask ourselves is, what is the role that we need to play as corporate partners to our communities? What is the role that we need to play as conveners, as collaborators, and as engines of change? And, when I think about, our role in this space, we are not absolved from trying to help to solve the issues that you all work every day tirelessly to solve. We are not absolved. So as a corporate organization, as a corporate entity, we have a responsibility to do this and to figure out ways in which to ensure that we are doing our part. So I'll set my brief conversation up by showing you a brief video. So if we can run the video. I think someone is supposed to play video.
The overall college enrollment rate for Boston public school students sits slightly below the Commonwealth's enrollment rate. But of the students who do enroll, fewer than 50% actually complete college. Additionally, research shows the Commonwealth's unemployment rate is cut in half if students earn a 4-year college degree compared with those who only receive a high school diploma. We can help.
Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with a lot of charitable organizations and public and private partnerships focused on providing young people with the education and skills they need to find sustainable employment. And while many of these groups are doing really good work, there's not much coordination among them, which I find extremely frustrating. It got me to thinking, how could State Street make a greater impact on the workforce development challenge? After all, we're one of Boston's largest employers, and that's important. The ultimate prize at the end of your education is a job and a career, and we can provide that in ways that nonprofits can't. When I began talking about this idea inside the company, employees were enthusiastic. We wanted to go beyond spot solutions and put together a comprehensive, systematic, and scalable program, one aimed at producing measurable and sustainable outcomes. That's how we came to develop Boston Wins.
Today, we lead a charge for change with the Boston Workforce Investment Network, or Boston Wins. We're focusing our philanthropic efforts, leadership, and people to better prepare our city students for 21st century careers. Since June 2015, we've been partnering with 5 standout local and national nonprofits: Year Up, Bottom Line, Boston Private Industry Council, College Advising Corps, and You Aspire. Together, we're focusing on education and workforce development programming that will drive real results. The State Street Foundation is providing an investment of $20 million over 4 years to its nonprofit partners, amounting to roughly $4 million for each organization. In addition to its financial commitment, State Street supports Boston Wins by encouraging employee volunteerism and supporting the placement of executive board members for program oversight, doubling matching gift support for the Boston Wins nonprofit partners, and making a firm pledge to hire 1,000 Boston youth who complete one or more of the WINS programs over the next 4 years. Trusting the theory that we are stronger together, our 5 partners align to offer services and support across the academic continuum, from high school to post-collegiate. We're projecting a 61% increase in the number of youth these organizations are able to serve. Although our 5 partner organizations operate independently, we expect them to work together closely, and we call this coordinated action.
Coordinated action refers to our intention to deliver these services in a complementary, reinforcing, and properly sequenced manner. We closely track the services that each student is receiving. All 5 partners enter their data into a shared system every 2 weeks. We track students across 12 milestones that they must reach by certain dates, such as submitting college essays, completing financial aid forms, and doing a mock interview. Coordinated action allows us to confirm that students are staying on track, to identify those who may have a gap in the support they're receiving, and to ensure that effective handoffs are taking place between the partner organizations, especially when students make that big leap from high school to college.
This interrelationship between organizations helps to ensure that each program participant has access to the tools and resources they need to gain sustainable employment. As new influences and obstacles appear and economic divides become wider, we need to help pave a path for Boston youth to navigate and succeed. Boston Wins is about a connected approach with a shared goal of strengthening the communities in which we operate and leaving a lasting impact on those who need it most.
So this effort, if you recall in the video, it called out that we were hoping to increase the capacity of these organizations by 60% over the next 4 years. Capacity building around staff augmentation, capacity building around services, capacity building around thought, leadership, knowledge. And one of the things that Nathalie mentioned, 3 things that she mentioned that I think are critical to what we call coordinated action are the sustainable long-term approach, the democratizing of assets, which is what we're doing, so they all are sharing in one of the not-for-profits databases that they had created, and they're sharing assets across all 5 not-for-profits, which had never been done before. And they're building long-lasting relationships. These 5 not-for-profits are now tied at the hip and will continue to be tied at the hip even long after we're sort of gone and have moved on to invest in other great collaborations. So it's working. You can see there the numbers, the amount of youth that's being serviced in the city of Boston. So public, private, nonprofit collaboration, they do work. They do work. And what's exciting for us is that we'll continue to invest in these relationships. So we are at the tail end of year 3. Great thing is the commitment that we made of hiring these young, amazing people, is alive and well. We have hired close to 600 of them. We provided close to 1,000 internship opportunities to these youth during the last 3 years, and that's just in addition to the thousands of other internships that we've sort of supported over the last 30 plus years. So as we look towards the future, what's next, what do we need to do, we understand that we need to continue to create sustainable systems, and we need to continue to ensure that these high-performing not-for-profits continue to collaborate. And so we continue to, and will continue to invest in them for the next additional 2 years. So now it becomes a 6-year commitment and investment. And, we, at State Street, my job, besides the workforce development things that we work on, is to truly drive a more inclusive organization, is to literally take a look at talent, the most creative, most innovative talent that happens to be a stone's throw away from most of our offices that are located in urban settings. So proximity to us is really important. And they happen to be literally a block or 2 in some cases, a mile or 2 in others. So they're that close. Yet, we might as well be a million miles away, because in their minds and in their perception and perspective, they don't understand what it takes to get there. They don't know what it is to get there. And, as mentioned earlier, their zip code confines them. I was one of those kids, right? So I talk about how I grew up in one of the poorest zip codes in Boston, and somehow found myself in one of the most affluent zip codes in Boston until recently. And then decided, and we were having this conversation earlier about me moving back to, I used to live in the South End, and moving back to Dorchester, and figuring out what can I do personally and what I can continue to do in my position with my company to ensure that we are moving the needle forward. So with that, I thank you for listening to me, and look forward to the conversation we're about to have with the rest of the panelists.
Thanks so much. You can go ahead and sit. Great. So now I'd like to invite the rest of our speakers to come up on stage for a little conversation. just missing a microphone, so you guys can So here's where the magic really happens. So I wanted to leave plenty of time at the end of the session for conversation and kind of interaction between you all, because you come from very different worlds, and you probably don't get a chance to talk all that often. And how often do we get so many brilliant minds up on one stage, which is very exciting for us. So just to kick things off, I'd like to ask a question that I'm sure a lot of you are thinking out in the audience, which is, gee, all of this sounds great, and I'm really busy and I'm very resource constrained, and collaboration takes time, and interacting with the tech world or the for-profit world takes time. What do I do? How do I do this extra stuff when I'm just trying to do my main job and do that really well every day? How do I make time for this? And how do I do that in the face of very constrained resources? So, anyone who wants to go.
So, first, just a couple of opportunities. So, a lot of the technologies that could be put in service of the work that you're leading are readily available at companies like Google, companies like Amazon. And they're now doing a much better job of trying to push those technologies out into the field. So for those of you who weren't aware, Google right now, currently, has a $25 million AI for social impact challenge that they've issued, where they are ready to invest both their own AI capacity and funding into your organization to leverage the AI that they can bring to the table. If you can just think of a set of data that you have that could serve as training data in order to achieve a social good in the work that you're doing. Analogous companies have challenges like this all the time. They don't require, you don't need to have the expertise. I haven't coded since I was in high school, right? But if you can think about the application of the technology and work with those who have the expertise, they can solve problems with you as partners. And those are opportunities available right now. Jobs for the Future and the Schmidt Futures group also have a $1 billion wage challenge right now, where they're looking for the ideas, but then they're going to come to the table with the funding and the technology. So I would look to those types of opportunities. The other thing I would say is, when it's a choice between trade-off of doing what you're doing and trying to go after these bigger initiatives, you have to sometimes make an honest assessment of, like, is another hour of just doing what I'm doing really going to be the thing that is going to change the lives of the families that I'm working with? Is it enough? And if it's not, you have to be willing to either put in some extra time or set aside some time to shoot for transformative change.
Can I take that? I was just going to say, sometimes people can't afford to not slow down. And in some ways, slowing down and getting more intentional and building in more analytic methods could actually save time in the long haul and create more kind of precision and discipline in the change process. And so I work a lot with government agencies that don't have a lot of time or money. And so that really has seen this kind of cost savings. So you saw the Philadelphia example, saving 20,000 hours of staff time and clients, and then how do you reinvest those resources? They were, staff were spending 80% of their time on paperwork. We were trying to free up the staff so that they could have more time. So that's my answer, is sometimes you can't afford not to slow down sometimes, and getting more intentional.
So I'm going to butcher this proverb. It's an African proverb that goes something like, if you want to go fast, go alone. You heard that one? But if you want to go far, kind of have to go with your team. I'm butchering it, paraphrasing, but it's so true. And I think that as not-for-profits, you have to determine and decide, do you want to go fast? And how fast you want to go, and how far are you going to get, by not thinking about what is it that we're not doing, not thinking that others are doing really well, that we can sort of, connect to and share resources and go much farther. And I think that's the challenge that we have as well, where we started this and we started thinking of getting these not-for-profits together and sort of almost forcing them to collaborate, right? And in a way that is really constructive, and it has worked really well. So then we started thinking, well, we can't be the only company that's doing this. And so how are we going to challenge, our other fellow, whether it's industry or neighbor companies, to think and do the same? And we are actually doing that. Our CEO is part of the Mass Competitive Partnership, which is a number of CEOs of the largest companies in Massachusetts. And these are the type of conversations that they're having constantly, and collaborative models that they're thinking about, so that now those companies are starting their own type of coordinated action set of collaborative collaborations, so that we can move fast but far at the same time.
Aren't you guys the people that do mobility mentoring? And isn't one of the categories managing, you've got too many things you have to do, and when you got too much input, you can't decide, but if you don't think about it, I think
Yes,
this field
challenges.
needs a little mobility mentoring. I mean, if we're gonna get to the next level, it's not good enough to say I'm working too hard. That's what we tell, folks that are struggling every day, and all of us have that struggle. And it's not a matter of which or what. It's setting some priorities and deciding if we really want to make a difference in the lives of the people we care about. We are going to figure out a way to take it to the next level. Otherwise, we can keep doing what we're doing, and we'll get the same outcome we're getting.
That's great. We can build a new bridge.
Yeah. Actually, I think this is already one of your bridges.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just wanted to say, give yourselves a hug and a pat on the back, because that's exactly what you're doing by being here today. And then the second thing I would say is think about your mission, and not your organizational goals, but fundamentally why you and your organization exists, because that will really help you prioritize and make the right decision.
Thank you so much. So I want to give you all an opportunity to ask questions of each other, if you have them, before we kick it to the audience.
I have a question for Luke. So I loved all the stories about diapers. Being a new grandparent, I'm kind of into this now, right now. But my real question, this is all about, so far, a lot of it's about making things more inexpensive and feasible and so forth. But I think one of the places that I am most struck by the failure of technology is actually in the way labor markets work. Labor markets work. For all of us, we think, we're, at least for many folks, we're well-educated. Sure, you're going to go from one job to the next, and you got LinkedIn, you got all these other kinds of things. And yet the part of the market that just throws away information like crazy is the low-wage labor market. You're going to work at a place like Walmart or whatever else, and, your car breaks down, you may have been a good worker for 3 years, but your car breaks down and for 3 days you can't make it in. And some of these places, sorry, that's just the story, goodbye. And no one will ever know whether you were a great worker or whether you were, how do we use technology to really say, if you do great, the next person's gonna know. No one calls Walmart and asks for references, and if they do, I bet Walmart says, no, we don't do that. So how do we think about making markets, as it were, work for struggling families, not just folks like us who are, okay, great, we'll just look it up.
Yeah, so two quick thoughts on that. One, I think Walmart actually is thinking about using data with respect to their workforce and actually serving their workforce, thinking of their workforce as a customer of the company. And that's something that they've begun recently. I recently heard an update about their stated goals. We need to see if they follow through, but their stated goals on better serving their workers using the data that they have available across their frontline workforce. I will say, in a future where you can bring more of your skills along with you, it might be the fact that distributed ledgers or blockchain enables more of this, that as people are taking even basic trainings at work, that the skills that they're gaining in those trainings aren't just stuck at Walmart, but rather they can take those skills with them on a blockchain and show that to a future prospective employer. I think that's a possible future that we should be shooting at. But the one other thing I want to say about the future of work and the way people are talking about it right now, it really concerns me that when people see AI-fueled automation destabilizing whole workforces and the rise of the contingent workforce, the 1099 workforce, that you've got folks like Chris Hughes or Sam Altman out in Silicon Valley, these billionaires, saying, "Oh, what we just need is universal basic income. We'll cut everybody a $1,000 check every month, and then they're just going to be fine. That'll solve it." That ignores the purpose and the self-worth that people derive from their work. So, what we're pursuing at ASU isn't a universal basic income, but rather our rejoinder to it, which is universal learning. The idea that we ought to be opening up and unlocking every knowledge enterprise across the country. Anyone who's doing any teaching, who's helping people gain skills, ought to be opening up those enterprises to reach as many learners as they possibly can to help them gain whatever knowledge, whatever skill they need to advance at any stage of their life. Right now, a lot of places, the question they ask is, are you a college-ready learner? If you're college-ready, then we're going to serve you. What they don't ask is, are we ready to serve you, right? Universally, whoever you are. And so that's the I think, mindset shift that we have to make if we're going to serve workers in the increasingly disrupted economy of the future.
Thanks, that was great. Do any of you other panelists have questions for each other you'd like to ask?
Not a question, but just to add to what Luke is saying is, what I've been thinking about and I've been sort of reading about is exactly that, the future of work and how the traditional worker is changing and the traditional work conditions are changing and what is expected of a worker in the workplace is changing. So, through MOOCs, right, and other types of accessible learning platforms, the future of work looks more like I am an independent contractor, I'm sitting at home, and I am deciding the kind of work, for whom do I want to do work for, and when and how and where. And so entrepreneurship is going to be key, and if we are not thinking about what we can do and our organizations can do to drive more of that, if we're not thinking about opening those and sharing those platforms, for people to learn and to gain new skill sets, and if big companies are not thinking about how we can contribute to saving the environment by not having people commute to work on a daily basis, but rather do work on a flexible work arrangement, which is one of the strategies that we fully leverage and support. I think we're missing the mark in what the future of work is and the opportunities to really change and transform the reality and the economic opportunity for people. And when you think about this generation and their access, their knowledge, and what they can do with technology is incredible. And so I think that we're going to be talking about a completely different workforce in about 10 years or so, and that's going to be a new reality for us.
Can I respectfully disagree?
You're an economist. You can't disagree.
Yeah. So the respectful part doesn't usually go with being an economist. I got a granddaughter, and I really don't think it's close to having robots take care of her. My mother is old and got some dementia. Again, it's not a robot world. I would say the Gates group that we put together, which had plenty of economists, we don't think there's going to be a shortage of jobs, and we actually we think we're a long way from Uber economy for everywhere, and in fact the numbers are really quite small. I think we've got a lot of jobs that are going to have to get done in this country by working folks, and I think the problem is about technology, it doesn't create good jobs. And yet there are important jobs that must be done, nurturing, caring, building, and so forth. That again, technology is a long way away. And I think a really important question is how do we turn those so-called bad jobs into good jobs? Because they're some of the most important work that goes on here, and yet they don't have ladders, they don't pay well, they don't have portable benefits and all those things. And I think, I worry that, of course, technology is changing things, and I'm a consumer of that as crazy as anybody. But the real fundamental question for so many folks that are trying to move ahead is they are in jobs where they don't go anywhere. And also, you know, you think about suppose a teenager came into you and said, should I start at Walmart or Dunkin' Donuts or we don't know. We don't know which firms lead to more mobility. We don't know any of that stuff. And to me, it's much more about taking bad jobs, so-called bad jobs, important jobs, and figuring out what it takes to make those good jobs. I suspect no one disagrees, but I'm just, again, I think focusing too much on the new economy, we forget about there's a big old economy there that's still going to be with us for a very long time.
Great. Thanks for your perspective. So I want to make sure to give some time to the audience to ask their questions as well. And I saw a hand shoot right up over here.
Hi, thanks everybody. This has been such a great session, hearing all these different ideas. I am curious, I think, with folks on the stage from the for-profit and nonprofit and academic sectors, and watching the video from State Street, I'll be honest, I bristled a little seeing our sort of sector diagnosed by a for-profit entity, that our problem is that we don't collaborate. You know, I think a lot of believers of collective impact are in the room here. And I'm curious, I think, you know, prescription without diagnosis is malpractice. And I'm wondering how we can work together across sectors to do a better job of diagnosing the challenges and also understanding each other's strengths so we know who to ask for support in different areas. Because I think we all do want to do right by these people we're serving, and we are very open and curious about learning from other sectors and envious of resources other sectors have, certainly. But how can we do a better job of identifying what the real challenges are together, and then working towards solutions so we don't have this sort of cross-sector diagnosis that I think can be really detrimental to buy-in?
If I may, you know, and I would say that this effort is not designed to put us in a position to say we know what the solution is, so therefore we're telling you what the solution is. Absolutely not. That's exactly the process we undertook. We actually did a lot of research and based on our experience. And prior to that, our frustration, and our CEO sort of mentioned it a little bit, was that we saw a lot of great not-for-profits doing a lot of great work. We just didn't see the needle moving fast enough. And we asked ourselves, how can we help? How can we help move the needle fast enough? So let's convene and let's get these organizations together to help teach us, actually, you know, how to do it, and then together figure out how do we want to move forward. So it wasn't, we know what's wrong, we're going to help you solve it, and here's how we're going to do it. It was more around, you know, we want to help, let's bring, you know, the experts to the table, and let's, again, diagnose, and then we can move forward together. And that's exactly what it's been. We don't, you know, we actually are a participant when we convene, and we convene on a quarterly basis, but they do the work, you know, but when we are at the table, we are not directing anything. We are participants, and we are learning and listening.
Just want to put in a pitch for the rapid redesign methods, the LI squared process, that learn stage, and that. Sorry, go ahead.
Can I, just another quick response. Look, I think it's important and fair to just state plainly that many of the challenges that those of us in this room are working to solve are generated directly by corporate America, right? That short-termism and the short-termism and focus on shareholder value and the rise of shareholder value as the sole purpose of most multinational corporations creates horrible jobs. You want to know why some of those jobs are bad jobs? It's because the focus is on shareholder return and buybacks and profits for the shareholders. Senator Warren here in Massachusetts, Senator Warner in Virginia have worked on some solutions for that. But the fact of the matter is, the current makeup of the Hill and the current makeup of the White House does not make it likely that those solutions are going to be enacted anytime soon. So I think it's important that then when we're looking to our corporate partners, that we put a little pressure on them to do what they can to help out. You know, just yesterday we announced that so Uber's been assailed in some quarters for some of their practices. I was really heartened that just yesterday we were able to announce that Uber's top drivers, the drivers who are driving the most hours, they're all going to be able to get a free college degree at ASU Online. And That's a big step forward for a company like Uber. Now, a lot of those drivers, they're a little bit older. Maybe they're not focused on a college degree at their point in life, so they're allowed to pass that on to a family member. Maybe their son or their daughter wants to get a college degree. They're going to be able to do that for free online at ASU. So that's a step forward. What Google's making available with their AI resources, that's a step forward. So, in the absence of legislation to address some of the fundamental drivers of bad jobs for low-wage workers, I think we should do and can do as much as possible to push on those corporations to have a broader sense of responsibility, a sense of who they are responsible to. And I think what State Street has done, what we just were announced with Uber yesterday, are examples of folks actually following through on that mission.
Great. Other questions? Really? Oh, there's one. I was like, really?
In terms of the private sector, and this is for maybe for Paul, but for all of you, we're talking about the private sector providing partnership and philanthropy that you all were talking about. But in terms of investment opportunities, could you talk a little bit about that? Because we haven't really touched on that in terms of maybe bringing the private sector in for actual investment opportunities and some of the innovations that might have been discussed either on this panel or through the day.
I would say that our investments, and Boston Wins being one of them, are focused on the education and workforce development sort of space. Not to say that from and I don't know if you meant investments from a business development perspective, whether we see a great idea that we think we can capitalize on and then we're going to put our resources into it, versus saying, we want to come up with, or we want to see innovative strategies that we can invest in so that we can drive more towards community building. I think businesses should be in the lookout, and that's why you see now a lot of CSR type of efforts and investments that are going into whether it's strategies or companies that are sort of focused on the greater good. And so that is happening. I am Rocky Kumar, who leads our CSR efforts from an asset management perspective, is uber focused on that. From an investment strategy perspective, that's why we launched the She Index Fund and Fearless Girl. For those of you who aren't familiar, State Street was, and State Street Global Advisors, where we decided to put that little girl in front of the charging bull on Wall Street. That's all part of, us understanding and valuing, what some of these companies that have the most diverse teams and that are most inclusive, we understand that they're more innovative and they're more productive and therefore more profitable. And so therefore we're going to take a look at those type of investment opportunities.
Great. So we are out of time, but before we break, I just want to give each of the panelists to have just a very quick final word. Our goal with this conference is that everybody will come away with at least 2 ideas that they can bring back to work on Monday. So when you think of on Monday, when everybody in this audience is back in their offices, getting back to work, what would be your one very, very quick word of advice for them? And we can start with you, Michelle, if you don't.
Wow,
Oh,
okay.
or whoever's ready. Sorry, that was a terrible thing to do.
I can totally do it. I think that innovative, intentional innovation is possible and desirable and will further the field if we can all work together on that. Otherwise, we'll still have flat interventions.
Perfect.
Get out the vote on Tuesday.
Thank you. Nathalie?
So I would say when you think about potential partnerships, think of the unusual suspect. Who is it that you haven't worked with that you, and is not really even on your radar, whether it's a private sector or whether it's somebody outside of your field. Try to reach out to somebody who's an unusual suspect and try to build a long-term partnership with them.
Thank you. Paul?
Don't give up. Continue to be relentless. Continue to focus on, what's your North Star. Continue to make sure that you help to change the narrative to
Great.
an earlier point.
Thank you. And Luke?
Don't give up. Be relentless. It's fantastic wisdom.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It's a great panel. So we're going to break for just 5 minutes before the next session, and then Dr. Williams will be giving her wonderful presentation to wrap us up today. So 5 minutes. Come on back.